Ashford, Virginia, November 9, 1931, 8:15 in the morning. The first thing Clarence Odell did every morning for 41 years was unlock the front door of the Ashford post office, set the flag, and open the incoming ledger to the previous day's last entry. Not to check it. He had checked it the day before. He opened it because the ledger was the record of what had moved through his hands, and what had moved through his hands was his life's work. And 41 years of that habit had made it as automatic as breathing. He was 63 years old. He had been postmaster of Ashford since he was 22, appointed by the County Democratic Committee in 1890, and reappointed through 6 administrations without controversy. Because Clarence Odell was the kind of man who made no enemies. Not because he was weak, but because he understood that a postmaster's usefulness depended entirely on the trust of everyone in the valley, and trust was not compatible with taking sides. He had a clerk, a woman named Doris Phelps, who had worked the counter for 19 years, and a rural carrier, Boyd Strunk, who drove the eastern route in a Ford that burned oil and had to be coaxed up the grade past the Rennick farm every Tuesday. Ashford was not a large town. It sat in the Clinch River drainage in Russell County, in the southwestern corner of Virginia, where the state narrows toward the Cumberland Gap, and its economy ran on coal from the mines in the ridges above the valley and on the dairy farms that occupied the bottomland. The post office was a 2-room building beside the general store. Clarence Odell had been in that building every working day since 1890. He knew every sender and every recipient in the valley. He knew the handwriting of the county solicitor and the return address of the seed companies, and the way the coal companies' payroll envelopes felt when they came through. And he knew the packages. They had been coming since 1907, not every month, not on a schedule anyone could predict, but when they came, they were always the same. Wooden crates, banded with iron, addressed in a typewritten label to the Bureau of American Ethnology in Washington, D.C., bearing a return address in Ashford that belonged to no building Clarence Odell had ever been able to find. Sent by men he had never seen before and never saw again, signed for, because he was required by regulation to log all outgoing parcels above a certain weight, and gone on the eastbound train by nightfall. He had logged 47 of them over 24 years. He had never seen what was inside a single one. This story does not begin with a field, a shaft, a bore rod striking wrong in the dark. It does not begin with a discovery. It begins at a counter, in a post office, in a small Virginia town, with a man whose entire career was spent inside the machinery of transfer, the mechanism by which objects moved from one place to another without anyone asking what the objects were, and who spent 41 years watching one category of thing move through his hands with professional silence, and understood, at the end of his life, exactly what that silence had cost. Russell County occupies the extreme southwestern corner of Virginia, bounded on the west by the Clinch River and on the south by the ridge that separates Virginia from Tennessee. The Clinch Valley coal field runs through the southern end of the county, and the mines that opened there in the 1880s and 1890s drew workers from Kentucky, Tennessee, and the exhausted iron districts of Pennsylvania, building small towns along the rail lines that serviced the tipples. Ashford was one of those towns. It had grown from a river crossing and a grist mill to a functioning commercial settlement in roughly 15 years following the arrival of the Norfolk and Western Railway extension in 1889. And by 1907, the year the first package came, it had a population of approximately 400 people, a school, 3 churches, 2 general stores, a hardware supplier, and Clarence Odell's post office. Odell had grown up in Russell County, the son of a dry goods merchant who had moved to the valley in 1871 from Tazewell County. He had 2 years of schooling beyond the common school curriculum, which in Southwest Virginia in the 1880s was sufficient to mark a man as educated, and he had the kind of memory, detailed, sequential, loyal to the original, that made him an exact keeper of records. He had been offered work as a deputy court clerk in Lebanon in 1893 and had declined it because the post office in Ashford was his and the valley was his, and he did not want to live in Lebanon. He had married a woman named Clara Whitaker in 1895. She died of influenza in 1918. He remained in the house on Church Street alone after that, with Doris Phelps running the counter and Boyd Strunk running the eastern route, and the ledgers filling year by year on the shelf behind the sorting table. The coal operations in the ridges above Ashford were run principally by the Clinch Valley Coal and Iron Company, a subsidiary of the Norfolk and Western Railway's landholding arm. The company employed between 300 and 400 men at its peak in the first decade of the century, operating 3 separate shaft operations on the eastern ridge. Number 1 opened in 1891, Number 2 opened in 1899, and Number 3 opened in 1903. It was a routine operation by the standards of the Virginia coalfield. Nothing about it distinguished it from 100 similar operations in the region, except for the closures. The Clinch Valley Coal and Iron Company closed all 3 shaft operations between 1903 and 1911, each closure occurring within 18 months of a reported incident at the workings. The first closure, Number 1 shaft, followed a report filed by the mine superintendent in September 1903 describing a sealed chamber found at depth during lateral drift expansion. That report is in the Norfolk and Western Railway Administrative Archive at the Virginia Tech Library in Blacksburg, accession number 74, box 16. It describes the chamber in 6 lines: the dimensions, the presence of remains, the decision to seal and close. It does not describe the remains in any further detail. It does not identify who made the decision or on whose authority the closure was ordered. The shaft was sealed and bricked within 60 days. The company's own geological survey, filed with the Virginia Bureau of Mines in 1902, had projected 22 years of viable extraction from Number 1. The company walked away after 11. The second closure, Number 2 shaft, followed a similar report in 1907, the same year the first package arrived at Odell's counter. The third, Number 3, in 1911. By 1911, the Clinch Valley Coal and Iron Company had ceased all operations in Russell County, transferred its land holdings to a private trust administered from a Richmond law office, and dissolved its Virginia corporate registration. The men it employed found work elsewhere or left the valley entirely. The mines were sealed. The ridge roads grew over, and the packages continued. The first package arrived at the Ashford post office on March 14, 1907, 4 months after the Number 2 shaft closure. Clarence Odell logged it, as he was required to do. Date, weight, destination, sender's name and address. The weight was 42 pounds. The destination was the Bureau of American Ethnology, Washington, D.C. The sender's name, as given on the typed label, was G. Harmon. The return address was 14 Depot Street, Ashford, Virginia. There was no building at 14 Depot Street. Depot Street ran along the rail line for 3 blocks. The buildings on it were the depot itself, a coal broker's office, and a feed store. Number 14 was a vacant lot, a narrow gap between the coal broker and the feed store that had never been built on. Clarence Odell knew this because he had walked that street every working day for 17 years. He noted the discrepancy in his personal log, a separate notebook he kept alongside the official ledger, recording things he considered irregular, and went on with his day. The package went east on the evening train. The second package arrived 6 weeks later. Same destination. Different sender name. R. Collier. Same return address on Depot Street. Same vacant lot. Same eastbound train. He wrote it down. 41 years of professional habit made him write everything down. Over the next 24 years, he filled 3 personal notebooks with the record of what came through his counter from the non-existent building on Depot Street. The date, the weight, the sender name as given, and a 1-line observation about the man who brought it in. because there were always men who brought them. Never the same man twice, as far as he could tell. Different faces, different builds, always in plain work clothes, always paying the postage in coin, always gone before Boyd Strunk finished his morning sort. They did not linger. They did not make small talk. They set the crate on the counter, gave the name when asked, paid the postage, and left. He recorded 47 packages between 1907 and 1931. The weights ranged from 38 pounds to 86 pounds. The destination never varied. The sender names were always different, always male, always the same non-existent address on Depot Street. He never asked what was inside them. A postmaster does not ask what is in a package. That is not the postmaster's function. He logs it and sends it, and 41 years of professional discipline and the respect of every family in the valley rested on that principle without exception. He never asked. But he thought about the timing. He had been thinking about the timing since the second cluster in 1908. The packages arrived in groups, 3 or 4 within a span of weeks, then nothing for months, or sometimes longer, then another group. And after the second cluster, Clarence Odell began to notice that the packages arrived in the weeks following unusual activity on the eastern ridge, activity that was not extraction because the mines were sealed, and not maintenance because the company no longer existed. Unmarked wagons on the ridge road at night, lights near the number 2 collar in the early morning hours. The kind of activity that the men who had stayed in the valley mentioned to each other without pressing it. Odell heard it at the general store. He heard it from Boyd Strunk, who drove the eastern route and whose road passed the base of the ridge. He wrote what he heard in his notebook with the date, and then he wrote the date of the next package, and over the years the correlation resolved itself from suspicion into pattern. He noted it in 1907, 1909, 1911, 1914, 1917, 1919, 1922, 1925, 1928, and 1931. 10 clusters in 24 years.
Activity on the ridge, then packages, then silence, then activity again. The Bureau of American Ethnology had been established by an act of Congress in 1879, administered under the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. Its stated mandate was the documentation of Native American cultural and physical remains across the United States.
Its actual operational pattern, as reconstructed from its own published reports and from the field correspondence that survived archival transfers, extended well past cultural documentation into physical specimen collection across the period 1880 through 1930. The Bureau's field operatives, men who traveled without presenting written credentials, who arrived at discovery sites within days of reports, and who removed materials without leaving receipts or manifests, operated across 26 states during those 50 years. Their acquisitions fed a specimen catalog that ran to thousands of entries in the Bureau's published accession logs. Those logs show a consistent pattern of gaps. The gaps are not random. They cluster in the same geographical regions, the same time periods, and the same categories of object. Large skeletal remains, sealed chamber contents, anomalous metallurgical finds, where the field reports describe the most significant removals. The Bureau's accession files for the period 1907 through 1931 contain no record of incoming parcels from Russell County, Virginia. Not one entry in 24 years of documented shipments from Ashford appears in any accessible Smithsonian accession file.
A Freedom of Information request filed in February 2019 by the independent researcher Harold Vance, requesting all accession records for incoming parcels from Virginia addresses during the period 1907 through 1931, produced 43 pages of responsive documents. Not one references Ashford or Russell County. The Smithsonian's response noted that pre-1940 accession records were incompletely digitized and that some records from this period might not be retrievable through current systems. It did not offer to search physical archives. It did not offer to identify which Virginia accessions from this period were accessible and which were not. It acknowledged the incompleteness and closed the inquiry. Vance filed a formal appeal in June 2019. The appeal was denied in September 2019. A reasonable search of available records produced no trace of 47 packages that a postmaster in Ashford, Virginia, logged by hand over 24 years and sent to a specific address in Washington, D.C. In the autumn of 1921, something changed in what Clarence Odell knew. The change came not from anything he saw himself, but from Aaron Flick, who owned the general store adjacent to the post office and was the closest thing Odell had to a daily confidant in the years after Clara's death.
A man had come into Flick's store in October of that year, middle-aged, well-dressed, not a coal man by his appearance, passing through on the Norfolk and Western line, and had mentioned that he had been up on the eastern ridge looking at former Clinch Valley coal and iron property for a landholding trust he represented. He had been at the number 1 site. The sealed entry was intact, he said, but the land around it showed recent disturbance, soil turned within the past season, equipment marks from a tracked vehicle, what appeared to be a temporary campsite 200 yards from the shaft collar. He mentioned this as a matter of property observation. Flick mentioned it to Odell that afternoon because he found it odd that anyone would camp near a sealed mine shaft. Odell wrote it down that night. A tracked vehicle, a temporary camp. October 1921. No packages had come through his counter in 1920. 4 came in the spring of 1922. The last package Clarence Odell logged was dated September 4, 1931. 61 pounds. Bureau of American Ethnology, Washington, D.C. Sender, W. Allard, 14 Depot Street. He wrote it in the personal notebook and in the official ledger, the way he had written every one. He retired the following month. October 1931. 41 years behind the same counter, and he left it without ceremony, because ceremony was not his register. He went home to Church Street and sat in the parlor and spent 4 weeks with his daughter Margaret, who had come from Bristol to care for him in his last months. And in November he told her what he had carried for 24 years. Margaret Odell was 38 years old in 1931. She had grown up in Ashford, left for Bristol after her marriage, and come back when her father's health made it necessary. She was practical, like him, precise in the same way, attentive to the same kind of detail. She bought a lined notebook at the general store and wrote down what he told her as he told it, because she understood that he was being precise on purpose, and that the precision mattered. He gave her the dates and the weights and the sender names from memory. He had a postmaster's memory for the record, and the record was 41 years deep. And he described the correlation with the ridge activity, the timing of the clusters, the conversation Flick had relayed in 1921. He told her about the 3 personal notebooks and where they were kept, in the bottom drawer of the sorting table in the post office, because he had not wanted to bring them home, and he had trusted the post office over any other building in Ashford. He told her one other thing. In March 1914, a package had arrived differently from all the others. The man who brought it had set it on the post office step rather than carrying it to the counter. Odell had heard it land from inside, a dull impact, and gone to the door to find the man already at the end of the walk and not turning back. The package had struck the step at an angle and cracked along the lower right corner, a seam perhaps an inch wide in the wood, the interior packing visible where the crack gaped. Odell carried it inside. He was required by regulation to rebind any parcel damaged in transit before forwarding it, and he went to the supply shelf for twine, and as he lifted the package to bring it to the table, the packing inside shifted. Through the crack, for perhaps 2 seconds, he saw what was inside. He described it to Margaret exactly as he had seen it. A curved surface, the color of old ivory, approximately the diameter of a serving plate at the visible portion. Smooth, unbroken surface, unmistakably bone. And at the edge of the crack, where the packing shifted when he tilted the package, the orbital ridge of a skull, visible for less than 2 seconds before the packing resettled. He had seen enough skulls in his life. Russell County buried its dead in plain wooden boxes, and the postmaster saw what the county saw, to know the scale of what he was looking at. The orbital ridge he could see through a 1-inch crack in a crate on a March afternoon in 1914 was wider, by his estimate, than anything he had seen on a living man's face. He could not measure it. He bound the package with twine, logged it in both books, and put it on the evening train. He wrote that night. March 14th, 1914, package from Depot Street, cracked on step, bound and sent. What I saw through the crack, bone, skull, width at orbital, wider than a man's. He did not elaborate. He was not a man who elaborated beyond what he had seen. He had seen what he had seen, and he wrote what he had seen, and he went on with the next day's work. He told Margaret this was what he had been thinking about for 17 years. Margaret kept her notebook. She returned to Bristol after her father's death on November 20th, 1931, and she took his 3 personal notebooks with her, along with her own record of what he had described in the parlor. She kept all 4 notebooks for the rest of her life. When she died in 1968, she left them to her son Robert, who stored them in a box in his garage in Bristol, Tennessee, with no particular awareness of what they contained. When Robert died in 1990, his wife donated the contents of his home office to the Bristol Public Library's local history collection. The box went with the donation. The library cataloged the notebooks in 1993 under Odell, Clarence, Personal Papers, 1907 to 1931. 4 notebooks, open to researchers. No researcher has requested them since they were cataloged. The Clinch Valley Coal and Iron Company's former land holdings in Russell County are now held by 3 separate entities. The number 1 shaft site, 48 acres on the eastern ridge, is controlled by Pennant Ridge Properties LLC, registered in Delaware, registered agent in Wilmington, whose filings trace to a federal contractor specializing in land title management. Pennant Ridge has filed no commercial activity with the Virginia State Corporation Commission since its incorporation in 1981. The number 2 shaft site is held by Harmon Creek Timber LLC, also Delaware registered, the same Wilmington registered agent address. No timber operations on file. No activity of any recorded kind. The number 3 shaft site, 33 acres, was transferred to the United States Forest Service in 1967 under a land exchange that moved the parcel from the Richmond Trust, which had held the Clinch Valley properties since 1911, into federal ownership as part of the Jefferson National Forest. The Forest Service maintains a locked gate on the number 3 access road. There is a no trespassing notice and a Forest Service sign. There is no trail, no recreational designation, no resource extraction permit. A Freedom of Information request filed in March 2020 by Harold Vance, requesting all Forest Service administrative records for the number 3 parcel since 1967, produced 11 pages. 2 were a land exchange deed and a boundary survey from 1967, and 9 were redacted in full under Exemption 7, the law enforcement exemption. No explanation for the law enforcement classification was provided. The registered agent address shared by Pennant Ridge Properties and Harmon Creek Timber in Wilmington traces to a corporate services firm that also acts as registered agent for 6 other LLCs holding former coal and timber parcels in the Clinch Valley drainage across Virginia and Tennessee. The oldest was incorporated in 1971, the most recent in 2009. Their collective holdings in the drainage cover approximately 900 acres. None of it is in active commercial use. None of it generates any recorded revenue. All of it sits above sealed shafts and former ridge roads, and the accumulated annual cost of maintaining 900 acres of idle land through 40 to 50 years of property tax, registered agent fees, and corporate compliance filings represents a deliberate, sustained expenditure with no commercial rationale visible in any public record. A company does not absorb the cost of maintaining 900 acres of idle land for half a century on the basis of administrative inertia. A federal agency does not classify 53 years of records at a former coal site under the law enforcement exemption on the basis of routine administration. The Smithsonian Institution does not fail to produce a single accession record for 47 documented shipments to a specific federal address over 24 years on the basis of incomplete digitization. Each of these absences is individually explicable. Together, they form a structure. The structure has the shape of something that has been maintained, actively and at cost, because what is beneath the eastern ridge above Ashford is worth more to whoever controls these parcels than the 50 years of carrying charges they have paid to keep it inaccessible. Clarence Odell never said what he thought was in the other 46 crates. He described the one he had seen through the crack in 1914, and he gave his daughter the dates and the weights and the correlation with the ridge activity, and he let the arithmetic speak for itself. He was a postmaster. The arithmetic of the record was his medium. 47 packages, 38 to 86 pounds each. 24 years. No receipt from the receiving institution. A skull at the orbital wider than any living man's face. He did not need to say what it meant. He had spent 41 years logging what moved through his hands. The log said everything he needed it to say. Clarence Odell, 63 years old, November 9th, 1931. He unlocked the door of the Ashford post office for the last time that autumn and opened the incoming ledger to the previous day's last entry the way he had done every morning for 41 years. His hands knew exactly where to turn on the page. He had made that turn so many times that the ledger fell open to it on its own, the binding worn soft at that place from 41 years of the same gesture, the same hour, the same careful man checking the record of what had come through. The notebooks are in a library in Bristol, Tennessee. They have been there for 32 years. The 3 shaft sites above Ashford are still sealed, still held by entities whose ownership traces to the same Wilmington address, still sitting above whatever the Clinch Valley Coal and Iron Company found at depth in 1903 and 1907 and 1911, and sealed before anyone could ask. The packages that moved through Clarence Odell's hands between 1907 and 1931 are somewhere, in a federal building, in a storage room, in a catalog that does not list them. Or they have been moved again, the way they were moved the first time, in crates with no manifest and no destination anyone will acknowledge. The orbital ridge he saw through the crack in March 1914 is somewhere in that same system. It has been somewhere in that system for 111 years. What it is not is gone. Clarence Odell wrote it down. His daughter wrote it down. His daughter's notebook and his 3 notebooks are on a shelf in a finding aid in Bristol, Tennessee, under a dead man's name, waiting for the first researcher who asks. The blacksmith in Kanawha County, who spent 3 days trying to melt what the federal men missed. His story starts with a different kind of professional knowledge and the same institutional silence.